Hi. Thank you. Does it sound all right? So my name is Brad Urani. I'm very, very honored to be here. Whose first Southeast Ruby is this? Yeah, because it's the first year, right? Mine too. What a coincidence. I'm very honored to be here. I saw the speaker lineup. I was like, holy cow! I had a moment of panic. Like, wow, I get to speak on the same ticket as all those people. That's awesome. This is an incredible event. Everyone, please just give a big hand to Jason for throwing this. We really appreciate this. This is awesome. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, right? I live in California now, but I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, which is a barbecue state. I'm really excited to get barbecue after this. The funny thing about California is it's awesome, but they don't know what the word means. They'll invite you and like, hey, you want some barbecue? And they'll like grill a tri-tip, right? Like we all know this, like tri-tip's not bad, like it's okay, but it's not barbecue, right? That is a grill. We all know that barbecue is cooked in a smoker, right? They don't know that out there. So I'm really excited to get barbecue because I miss it. But this is a technical talk, right? It's a software talk. It's kind of half like high-level technical, kind of half about process. It's about how to build huge web applications, sort of like the technical advice, right? Design patterns and things you should focus on. The spoiler alert, right? The key to this turns out that it's not necessarily like specific types of class design or specific like technical tools you should use or anything. It's really about restraint, simplicity, and focus, right? By restraint, I mean focusing on what's really, really, really important, not getting trapped into doing things that aren't helping you, right? That could potentially be liabilities. Keeping things simple, letting the simple things be simple, right? And focus with laser-like intensity, right? On solving customer problems, on delivering value, and making sure that you're working on the right thing. So, little story, right? So in 2015, I found myself working for a company that did huge software. It came out through like a weird set of circumstances. I'm a startup guy. I've mostly been a startup guy all my life. I was working for a little 10-person startup, right? And we got acquired by a big company with 5,000 people in it. They had a giant code base. It's financial software, right? It's the software that like your financial advisor uses when he or she sits behind the terminal and trades stocks for you, right? I'm not going to name names. If you're not a financial advisor, you've probably never heard of it. But I found myself part of this huge organization with a huge code base, over 1 million lines. It's a giant Java application. Development team was split across the US and India. And I noticed something. It was a very waterfall company, right? This company released their software twice a year. They had waterfall releases every 6 months. And the CTO, actually, I talked to him and he said, you know what? Our customers, they don't like it to change that often. I think we're going to change to once a year releases. And I was like, really? Once a year releases? Alarm bells right there. Your customers don't like changes, right? And this company had a lot of big meetings, very complex tools. Just launching the app was very, very difficult. They had people with highfalutin titles like architect and senior DBA who like kind of dictated top down like certain class design decisions, how you should design database tables and schemas. You had to ask 18 different people permission if you wanted to add a column, right? Every stakeholder signed off on every feature. And they had scared customers, right? So what is it? Like, what were they doing wrong? I don't know. I left immediately. I was not going to stay there, right? Moved to the West Coast, right? I work for Procore now. Procore makes software for the construction industry, right? People who build huge buildings, skyscrapers and opera houses and subways use our software. It's this full suite of tools to manage these kind of giant construction projects. This is our iPad app. It's got like blueprint management. We do some very cool things, location-aware kind of mobile stuff, and it's very, very neat. But it is also big software, right? Which is also very different from my startup experience. We have one of the largest Ruby on Rails apps in the world. It is over 1 million lines of code. It's hard to say what the biggest one is. I know Shopify's got us beat. I think theirs has like 3 million. I'd be very surprised if we're not in the top 10 largest. 13 years old, and we started on Rails 0.9. We had a very forward-looking CTO who way back when Rails, before it even launched 1.0, got us on Rails, which has been really, really great. Really awesome, but despite differences in the tech stack, these companies had a lot of similarities, right? These two projects, the financial software, the construction software, they even had a lot of the same features, right? Things you'd expect out of that kind of software, user management, document management, reports, and things like that, right? They're both heavily relational, right? Fully normalized databases. Ours has 800 tables in it, right? I think theirs was about the same. So we're very reliant on SQL, lots of joins, right? And neither of these companies are do one thing well kind of companies. It's not like Instagram or Twitter where they basically just have to show you a feed, right? We're talking software with thousands of features, so many that like no one really knows them all. You know, you could call it enterprise. I hate that word because it does kind of describe the product. It doesn't really describe the culture, right? So we've got some similarities there, right? Both are big teams. Our team has, it's got over 100 devs, the majority of which work on back-end Rails all day, every day on the same app, right? So that's a lot of devs working on a single Ruby on Rails apps. So we had similarities between these two companies, but also differences, right? They were doing 6-month waterfall releases. We were deploying 4 or 5 times a day. So we've got a drastic dichotomy here, a night and day. What are the big differences? Let's take some guesses. Is it Ruby versus Java? Anyone think that was the difference? No, it's not. Not at all. Not at all. Java's a fine programming language also. That was not the problem. Is it construction industry customers versus financial industry customers? Turns out that's not it either. In fact, you think it's the opposite because the finance industry moved on to computers, you know, and has been in the forefront of computer technology way before the construction industry was. In fact, you all would be shocked at how much construction is done in the world using emailing Excel spreadsheets back and forth and sending faxes. Not even kidding, right? So it wasn't that, right? I'm going to tell you what it is, what I think it is, but disclaimer, this is my opinion, right? I'm one engineer. It's very possible that my teammates would get up here and tell a different story, right? And just a few assumptions before I explain how we do this, how we manage Ruby on Rails at 1 million lines of code, right? A few assumptions, right? First of all, this sort of strategy, this sort of philosophy, and the things I'm going to tell you, they're geared towards intensely competitive environments where you're shipping fast, trying to beat the competition, right? Trying to develop at a rocket ship pace, really, and keep momentum going and ship new features every single day. It's feature-heavy software, right? It's not a do-one-thing-well company. It's a do-everything company, right? And we're talking about growing teams where we're constantly hiring, constantly adding new people, constantly bringing up to speed, right? If this is not you, these might not be the strategies for you. You know, if you're a group of 4 very senior devs who all like the same design patterns and don't have plans to ambitiously expand and take over the globe, right? This might not be for you. This is what works for us in these situations. So starting with technical, right? So Ruby on Rails, right? Let's start with a simple one. Watch out for N+1 queries. A lot of the biggest performance mistakes, right, and things that slow us down, right, and cause us to have problems are due to N+1 queries. Active Record, I love Active Record. It's a great ORM, but it makes some trade-offs. It makes it easy to do things fast. It makes simple things simple, but the design is such that it's very easy to make this mistake. Watch out for this one, right? Because if you let these fester, they can bite you, and they can be hard to undo sometimes. So keep a lid on these, right? If your output looks like this, right, when you run Rails apps, you've probably got N+1, and you should probably fix it. Okay, use MVC. Now this sounds like a little obvious. This is a Rails app, right? Rails is an MVC framework. Well, a lot of people like to add extra layers, right? And there are extra layers of class design, right? Service objects, command objects, various design patterns and things like that, right? Hopefully you've all read this book. It's wonderful. It's awesome. Sandy Metz comes to our office every year and teaches a 3-day workshop for all our new devs. And these patterns are great, but what I'm getting at is use MVC. Don't use them where you don't need them, right? I've seen a lot of people, they kind of like develop like sort of internal frameworks where it's like, okay, the controller calls the commands, which calls the service, which calls the model, and that's great in the spots where you need it, in the spots where it makes your life better. What you probably want to avoid is dictating that you have to use those patterns where things are simple. In other words, use all the design patterns in the book, use everything in this book where you want it, where you need it, but if you don't need it, stick to the basic MVC parts on the parts where it's not necessary, because too much boilerplate and too much internal frameworky code and extra layers gives you lasagna-style code, right, that you want. So make that kind of stuff, apply it where you need it, but make it opt-in. Embrace background jobs, right? This is one of the biggest things that happens at scale is you realize that that a lot of your work has to be shifted into background workers. So you all know the flow. It's like you go to buy an airline ticket or something, right? You click purchase, you get a screen with like a little loading graphic, right? And then later the page refreshes. That's because what they did is they dropped a job into a background system, right? They let it load, and then usually through a WebSocket or through some kind of AJAX polling, get back the result. One of the most important capabilities is to master this, master it early, and design your code base so that it's easy to shift workloads off of vanilla Rails into background jobs, right? If you're going to abstract away and add some architectures, this is a good place to focus on. I just said don't do that where it's not necessary, but this is one place where an investment in the architecture of your application pays off the ability to shift things into background workers quickly. Now, these come with their own problems, right? Runaway queues, right? Jobs that fail and backup queues. You're starting to get into distributed systems at scale sort of problems, right? That there's some lessons you have to learn. You'll probably make some mistakes, right? We have. But it's worth investing in learning how to do this, right? Manage dependencies. Okay. Our gem file has like 200 gems in it. That is a lot, right? That's like half as many as like a hello world in React, you know? So it's like, which is to say a ton, right? Be very, very skeptical of adding new gems. What I found is that big gems, right, are a liability. Big things that replace whole layers of the stack, that replace your entire view layer or change the way you interact with the database, right, can really, really, really bite you if you've got a long project that's done over years, right? Oftentimes you end up unwillingly being the maintainer of those gems because 5 years later they haven't upgraded. Now you've got to upgrade them. Small gems aren't so bad. If you have a lot of little gems that do little things, that's not so scary. It's the big ones, right, that really reinvent your stack that I would be very cautious about. Treat them like children, right? Only have as many as that you can take care of. So what did I just add there? Oh, be skeptical of abstraction. So this requires just like a little bit of explanation. We've all heard about like premature optimization, like don't prematurely optimize your app. And this really, really, really applies to abstraction. I would advise being reactive with abstraction. Do it write your app, write your code without the abstraction, and then once you see it working and you see it's performed and the customer has tried the feature and likes the feature and has given you feedback on the feature, then go back and extract your base classes, right? Build out design patterns. That doesn't mean don't do abstraction. Like, I gave this talk before and someone was saying, well, Brad, you said don't use abstraction. No, I said be skeptical of it, right? If you're not sure, if you're on the fence of whether you should create an abstraction, don't do it, ship the code, come back and add it later. Right? And don't over dry, right? Dry is generally good, but you can definitely overdo it. If you're extracting base classes to save 3 lines of copy paste, it's probably not worth it. I mean, I know we all have this like tendency to want our code to be perfectly abstracted, right? And perfectly dry, but sometimes that actually makes things worse, especially on big teams with a lot of people, right? And start with the simplest code that works. We like to ship code early and often to get it out there. Try not to let perfect be the enemy of good, right? And to try to get the feature out into the hands of the customers, usually with like a few beta customers first, before we come back and really try to dial it in and do it the right way, right? A good little metric I use is don't mix feature branches with abstraction branches, all right? Or with refactoring branches. Like if you see messy code and you want to fix it, but you also have to add a feature, do one first, then the other. Add the feature without cleaning up the code, launch it, ship it, come back, and then refactor them. When you start mixing those things together, you know, then you can back yourself into corners. It delays shipping, it delays features for one thing, right? We don't like that. But it also makes it harder to reason and makes you more likely to prematurely optimize and pick the wrong abstraction. So modularity, when I hear this word, alarm bells go off. People love to talk about modularity. Well, if I do the class design this way, I could take this out of the Rails app and put it into a Sinatra app. Or well, if we abstract away the database, we could switch out MySQL for Postgres. Like, ding, 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 ding. I know this is often touted as good software practice, but it's often the cause of some of the most egregious architecture mistakes and people getting backed into corners of messy sort of home-rolled frameworks and things like that, right, which they have to maintain now and which become a liability rather than an asset, right? So watch out for this word. Chances are you're not going to need to extract the code out of your Rails app, right, or put it into a gem. We do want to put stuff in gems, but you know, usually you can handle that problem when you get to that problem, right? You don't need to plan for that in advance. Embrace SaaS. So we use a lot of SaaS projects, a lot. We've got, this is probably half of like the third-party sort of services and things that are hooked into our Rails app, right? We've got analytics solutions like Google Analytics and Segment.io. We've got WebSocket Server, which is Pusher. We've got communications platforms like Twilio. A number of performance monitoring solutions like Scout and New Relic. LaunchDarkly is a feature flag, is a service one that we like. Datadog for infrastructure monitoring. These are great. You don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. These services like it always makes me a little nervous because like, what if they go down? Are they going to take us down? They're remarkably reliable. We've had very few problems. It has happened, but it doesn't happen as often as you'd think, right? And sometimes, quite honestly, it's just easier to throw money at a problem and buy a service than to try to do this stuff on your own. So we take much advantage of this. We're always careful about something where if it breaks, it will take down your app. That's bad. So we try to avoid those, but around the periphery and all the other things, we use as many as possible. And that's wonderful. What time is it? 2:15, halfway. All right, sorry. Okay, so feature flags for the win. Feature flags are a really, really, really great feature that definitely help you monitor, or that help you manage the complexity of launching features, right? We use actually a third-party one. It's called Launch Darkly, where it's actually, you use their gem and you kind of put it in your code, right? And you've got like, if the flag is on, do this. If the flag is off, do this. And then you can log into like this dashboard. It's performant because it caches the settings on the servers. So it's not like making API calls out to a third party every time. But that's good. And like using those is a really, really awesome way to control the launches of certain things. We don't take it to the extreme where it's like we merge everything right into master and everything's behind. We don't go that far, right? But feature flags are a tremendously helpful way to both control the code, right? If something does go wrong and you can turn something off, that's wonderful. A lot of them have like sort of A/B testing kind of built in where you could launch, like turn the feature flag on for like half your customers and off for the others. Very, very useful stuff. Use the database in your features. This goes back to what Hari Shankar said yesterday about using the power of the database, right? To your advantage, right? Using things like views instead of putting complex queries in the app. Use those foreign key constraints. It really bugged me like back before, was it Rails 4 where they added those in Rails? That was not really popular in the Rails community to add foreign key constraints to everything. Those are really useful things. The ACID compliant databases will really help you with your data integrity, right? Use the power of that stuff. All the indexes, and Postgres has done amazing things with like the JSON stores and the array stores. There are a lot of very incredible features, and if you offload a lot of that work, you'll end up with simpler apps, right? More performant apps, often. And do database design. This is really like a good thing to teach all the people on your team is like to be really good SQL engineers and to be really good database engineers. It's pretty popular like in Ruby classes and things like that, and people who are learning for the first time to kind of trust the abstractions that Rails puts over your database, which is really, really great for smaller projects, for rapid development, for people who are just getting it started. But those also become a liability, right, when you operate at massive scale on highly relational databases and things like that, right? Good education in SQL and how to use SQL and how to use a database responsibly and performant will pay off in spades. And this is my own little quote. For any non-trivial app, abstracting away the database is a mistake, right? Believe it or not, you cannot abstract away a database entirely. You have to know how it works under the hood because your performance is completely tied to it. And just like a few little things, I try not to overprescribe advice on like class design and things because it's so dependent on people's own opinions and how teams work. But here are a couple that I'll throw out there. Don't put queries in views, right? Don't be calling active record that fires off queries from the view layers or from the helpers. It makes it very, very, very hard to sort of like track down these things when they become issues, to see the n+1s. Try to isolate logic out of queries. It's very easy with active record to sort of like write one method that does the queries and the logic like kind of all together. Do your best to like kind of put those in separate classes or separate methods, right? Also helps testability. So that's good. So a little bit about process here, right? Because as you can imagine, the technical is only like kind of half the story. A lot of this work, like when you've got these big teams, big apps, right? High scale, massive, our database performance is out of this world. 20 million rows scanned a second, 30,000 transactions, right? When you're dealing with those kind of scales, right, and these kind of challenges, a lot of this comes down to people, how you work, how your team works, the kind of practices you encourage, and the way you kind of like design your teams and encourage them to communicate. And the number one goal in all of this is autonomy. It's to empower individuals and squads, right, to be able to make these changes, ship code, do everything they need to do without a lot of extra feedback and communication with other people, right? The goal here is to be able to create features, launch them, and ship them with as few hands as possible, right? We absolutely encourage collaboration, cooperation, communication across all lines, all over the company, but try our absolute hardest to make it not necessary, right? If you empower individuals to make their own designs, whether it's class design, whether it's testing best practices or the way to design their database, people have more ownership over the code they write. They feel more empowered to do these things on their own. They're more excited to go to work every day, and it does lead to better software. I love this little 2x2. I'll let you all read this. As you can see, right, if you don't have autonomy, you have a dysfunctional but probably reasonable successful teams. And this goes back to, remember what I was saying about, I worked at that, very briefly at that financial software company. They had architects and DBAs who dictated class design, who dictated when and how you added database columns and stuff like that. It saps people's excitement for their jobs, is what it does. And consistency is not necessarily the key. As software developers, oftentimes we really want, like, especially on our applications, we want to kind of like enforce like these kind of patterns and make all our things use the same style of class design, the same style of testing, right? On really, really big teams, on big apps, that becomes not only impossible, but also undesirable, because that saps autonomy people too. So we have, like, on our squads, we have some people who came from the Java world and they really love their, like, Gang of Four style patterns with factories and strategies and things like that. We've got a lot of people who are Sandy Metz. We try to encourage, like, Sandy Metz style, Pooter style design patterns. We've got a lot of people who do that. We've got some people who, like, only want to use MVC. Yes, it leads to fat models, but they like that trade-off. That's okay with them. And we encourage, like, these slightly different styles. We don't try to get everyone developing in quite the same way, which, like, seems kind of odd, right? Because it is one application. Doesn't that lead to, like, weird sort of corners where these styles of code converge and they interact in funky ways? Yes, but it's worth the trade-off, in my opinion, because it leads to people who are really, really invested and making choices at the lowest level. We split our groups up into squads of usually like 4 or 5 Rails devs, maybe a front-end dev, a mobile dev, a QA, a PM, different variations on that theme, but mostly small squads. And we try to push as much decision-making down into the squads as possible and not over-prescribe architecture from the top, right? And that it even goes so far as every one of those squads is deploying code, shipping it all day, every day, 5, 6, 7 times a day. Any one of those can have migrations, dropping tables, adding tables, dropping columns, and things like that, right? And we encourage that practice. That's what we want. We design our tools, our deployment tooling, our continuous delivery, our CI, and all that stuff around making those practices work. So do class design and testing practices, right? You can get into big discussions about testing. What is properly a unit test? Do you need to dependency inject, right? When does a unit test become an integration test? Should we test at the extremes? Is it okay to write a unit test that touches 2 classes and not just one? The answer is yes to all those questions. People work in different ways and have different styles, and that's just fine. So, and you always have to be changing all the time, right? The most damaging phrase in the language is, we've always done it this way. Everything that I'm talking about, all these practices, you have to be able to shift those on a dime, right? If something doesn't work, change it right away. Don't be afraid to change the way you do Git, to change the way you do deploy, to change the way you do basically anything. By the way, does anyone know who this quote is from? Official badass Grace Hopper, Rear Admiral of the Navy, who invented the compiler. She's awesome. If you read her Wikipedia page, it's incredible. Flexibility wins out overall, right? The ability to highly tune things to allow developers to kind of do things their way. For instance, some places where this might come into play, right, are like front-end spas, right? Like, if you got a big team on a big app, I would be very skeptical of forcing all the pages to, like, have to use React or something, right? Usually you want to pick you wouldn't want to probably mix Angular and React or Ember, but you probably wouldn't want to do that. You probably want to pick one, but you don't want to make it impossible. You don't want to make it so you have to use those things, right? People should be able to choose, like, I should make a React page or I should just make a plain old Rails page. Like I said, it just leads to faster shipping and happier devs. Where am I? So deployment, right, is kind of a tricky one. When I look at places like, a lot of this, if you notice, like the way I talk about class design and testing and being skeptical of abstraction, one way to, like, sort of phrase that is like, most of, like, your great engineering, the work you do that's really proud of, the hard problems you solve, should definitely be related to shipping the features, to getting the features working and in customer hands, right? This is one place that sort of breaks that rule. We've invested a lot of time and money and technology into our deployment infrastructure. Ours uses Slack. So all day, every day, people can use Slack to deploy branches. We've got it on a timer now, but if we need to, outside the timer window, right, deploy branches, deploy things to staging, we've invested massive amounts of time, and we've actually got a full team dedicated to maintaining a lot of these internal tools. It is one place where a little investment goes a long way, right? When you've got like this dozens and dozens of developers all working on a single app, they all need to be able to just click return. Not only does that save you an immense amount of time, but it encourages people to take pride in their work. When they're the one who presses the Slack command and hits OK, and they deploy, that feels good, that you don't have to wait for someone else. We obviously have to wait for the QAs to test it and stuff. It's actually kind of cool because every new developer who joins our team does a deploy in the very first week, right? The very first week, they join on Monday, and on Friday, they do a Slack deploy. And then we try to get people to deploy their own branches. It encourages that ownership. It encourages that autonomy. It makes people feel responsible for the code they write if everyone can deploy their own stuff. And that obviously requires a lot of trust, right? If you don't trust people with your code base, if you don't trust people to deploy their own stuff, if you don't allow squads to choose their own style of relational design or class design or testing design, right? If you don't trust people to do that, then you've hired the wrong people. You know what I mean? You end up with people, standing on each other's shoulders, right, to build these apps, which means you have to trust the people who you're standing. Well, that's a weird analogy, but you know what I'm trying to say, right? You have to you have to trust your teammates, right? You have to help bring them up to speed in the skills that they lack, right? Try to get everyone moving like clockwork, and that's important, right? Starting with a simple process that works is sort of our mantra, right? We don't do a lot of very fancy, complex Git strategies. It's gotten a little more complicated over the years, but it's gotten more complicated with the goal of making it easier to do. I know that sounds like an oxymoron, but it's true. Really start with the simplest strategy and the simplest tools and the simplest things you can, and complicate your lives only when it becomes necessary, when the simplicity of it is becoming an impediment, right? Code reviews, meeting schedules, testing, again, there's room for flexibility here, right? Even on big teams, people have different styles of code review, and that's okay, right? Some people do sort of a, I don't know, Scrum or Kanban, I don't even know what it is, where they've got a planning meeting on a Monday, and then the next week they do a grooming meeting, and then they do a retro. Some people follow that. Some don't, right? Some do estimates, some don't. It doesn't need to be enforced. You don't need to, on big teams, have everyone doing estimates or everyone not doing estimates. You know what I mean? Let the squads and the people choose. Preserve that team autonomy. I think I've gone over this enough, but in class design testing, even in database, right? Database, usually there's really kind of one, if you've got a lot of experience with relational databases at least, most of the time there's kind of a solution that just kind of makes sense. Usually you don't have to make a ton of choices, but sometimes you do, right? For instance, I hate polymorphic relationships. I really don't like them, but some of my teammates love them. So I encourage my squads not to use polymorphic relationships. Other squads do, and they really love them, and they think it's a great pattern. That's fine. Databases can be, we've got a beefy one too. Tooling for this kind of things becomes paramount. When you are operating at 30,000 transactions a second on a beastly box like this, you cannot lock the users table during a migration, right? But you want people to have the freedom to change the schema and adding columns and stuff like that any time of the day, all day. So that takes some tooling. We've got a lot of gems and internal tooling that generates whole migration. You need to add a column with a default and a not null, it'll generate 5 migrations for you that get around locking strategies. So good tooling helps you get around problems that arise only at scale. And training is everything. Not only in technical training, but also, we're in the construction industry, so not every dev, but I would say most devs need to kind of be construction experts to know how to calculate the carryover balance on a budget line item that went overdue because a vendor didn't ship a load of concrete or something like that. Requires deep knowledge about the domain. You know what I mean? Which means we have professors from universities who teach construction management come and teach people about construction. It's kind of funny. We hold a conference every year. It's called Groundbreak. It's for our customers and for our integration partners. A lot of construction industry people, and they'll, someone with 30 years of construction will walk up to one of our engineers, one of our 24-year-old engineers and start, mansplaining about construction, and she'll report back, oh, do you mean that you carry over the interest this way when you calculate the line item? And the people are shocked. I just got out-constructioned by a 24-year-old software engineer, you know what I mean? Which is amazing, but that's the kind of thing you have to do when you deal with complex domains. Let people choose their own work that's degree of realistic. That means encouraging people to work on technologies outside of, for instance, just Rails, right? We've had a lot of people move from Rails to front end to mobile, from Rails to mobile, from mobile to product, right? From QA to dev, from dev to DBA. To the degree that it's realistic, you should really encourage that. We've got this great internal open source model, right? We mentioned that squads try to preserve their autonomy and operate pretty much independently, but sometimes you do have to cross lines, so we treat it like open source. If you work on a budget and I'm working on bidding, right? I'll go in there, treat it like it's a gem, right? Open a pull request, ask for feedback, and that works really nicely. But ultimately, software is about people, right? The key to success is not your choice of technology, ORM, testing style. It's making people feel the pride of ownership in what they do, make sure every single person in your department feels like their contributions are being valued, and you're providing an environment in which they can grow and become better engineers and better people. Keep them close to the business so they hear from the customers themselves how helpful their work is. Choose processes that encourage ownership. When in doubt, remove processes, don't add them. Don't be afraid to experiment and remove barriers if they didn't make things better. Don't let perfect be the enemy of shipped. Hire great people and trust them, right? And I'll tell you what, remember I told you about the financial company I worked at and the customers were scared, where the customers hated change and they dreaded release day? If you do this, if you change the software and you have a really agile environment where you can really deliver, take feedback and ship features, customers will see that. And at first they may be a little uneasy, right? Because the software is literally changing every single day. Every day they logged in and the software has changed a little bit. But eventually they realize that you're doing it for their good, that you're listening to their feedback. And then what happens is they stop being afraid of change. Then they embrace the change. They learn to feel like they're part of the process because you listen to them and you make the software better for them. Then you have customers who love you and are your customers forever. Thank you. So I'm Brad Urani. Come talk to me. Like I said, I work in Santa Barbara at Procore. We are hiring like mad, like web, front end, back end, mobile, DBA, security, machine learning, all of it. I'd love to chat with you about it. Here are a couple slides, resources you can read about some of this stuff. I'll tweet them out. And come talk to me if you want to work on the beach.